something I read where you talked about your people from Mount Vernon saying that like they've done like 40 years in the penitentiary together. So, and incarceration rates in America has been a problem, especially as opposed to minorities. And Roman delves into the issues around the legal system. Do you think we've made any headway in the
I
legal?
think it's more important to make headway in our own house. By the time the system comes into play, the damage is done. They're not locking up 7-year-olds.
Yeah.
I was in Chicago a couple of 3-4 weeks ago, and we saw these little kids on bikes with masks on the side of their head, like 5 or 6 of them. And the driver said, "Yeah, they're little yummies." I said, "Who?" He said, "Little yummies. Look up, Google Lil Yummy." Lil Yummy was an 11-year-old murderer.
Wow.
And you look at his picture, you'll see the headshot of him, and he's like this. And he got murdered at 11 by a 14-year-old.
Wow.
Who's doing life now, and a 16-year-old.
That makes no sense.
You blame the system? Where was his father?
Yeah.
It starts in the house. It starts in the home. And well, my father got locked up. Well, where was his father?
Yeah.
Like I did talk about my 3 closest friends, and they did, 15 to 25. One did 28, this and that. I was the only one of the 3 that had a father in my life, even though my parents were together. But I still had a father who was a gentle man and a good example, and they didn't. We can blame the system if we want, but they didn't lock any of us up at 7.
Yeah.
We were all doing enough to get locked up at 13. My parents sent me in another direction. They didn't have anybody to help them, and they kept doing what they was doing.
It has been well said that the child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. I think that saying, that notion, is eerily true in the case of Lil Yummy, or as he was born, Robert Sandifer, nicknamed Yummy because he loved to eat cookies, chocolate chip cookies to be exact. It is quite the saga, it is quite the story, it is quite the tragedy. And in the first installment ever of a segment on my podcast, Changing the Narrative, a true crime segment, The Conscious Criminalist, I want to bring that story to you. How an 11-year-old boy from my city that I was born and raised in, became a murderer. The story of Lil Yummy. Robert Yummy Sandifer, born March 12, 1983, was an 11-year-old street gang member from Chicago, Illinois. Robert Sandifer was murdered by fellow gang members in Chicago, and his event garnered national attention because of his age, resulting in him appearing on the cover of Time magazine in September of 1994. Robert Sandifer, or Lil Yummy, was the last child of 9 born of Lorena Sandifer, who had over 30 arrests while prostituting. Many of these arrests were drug-related. Due to his mother's history, Robert Lil Yummy Sandifer was taken from his mother. When Robert was taken away from his mother and given to his grandmother, Janie Fields, the juvenile court concluded that her prognosis as a caregiver wasn't much more promising. The psychiatric report described Fields as very controlling and domineering. Robert Yummy Sandifer was physically abused from the time he was an infant. Before he was 3 years old, Sandifer was already known to the Department of Children and Family Services. It was alleged that Sandifer had cigarette burns on his arms and neck, as well as linen and bruising consistent with physical beatings. Many in the neighborhood where Robert lived had much to say about him. In the Times article about Robert, people said that he was a bully and that he smelled, and he was of a different breed. Others recall a sweeter side.
I just wanted to know what you think, what kind of guy he was.
Hey, man, he was a little kid.
He was a kid?
Yeah.
When you say he was, how old was he?
He was 11.
11. What was he like when he was a little kid?
He was a sweet little kid. He wasn't violent, and he wasn't bad. The way they got it, the way they talking about now, that's not true. It's not true.
Like when you say...
Every time somebody says something, they change it around. He was this and he was that, and I know that he was not.
Well, what was he like then? In other words, when he was growing up, like, did he have a sense of humor?
Yes, he did.
How did you find out that your nephew was killed?
What you mean how I found out he was
killed?
killed?
Did you get a phone call?
No. They just brought the picture here.
If I was to see this young man on the street, I've never seen him, right? What would I see? What did he look like? Was he a tall fellow? Was he short?
He was this short. He was very short. To be his age, he was real short.
Was he a bright fellow? Was he a smart guy?
Yeah, he was very bright and very smart. He can draw, he can read, he can write.
What kind of food did he like? I mean, was he...
He loved food, gyros. He ate a lot.
Mm-hmm.
When Mama had barbecues, he ate that. He ate a lot.
Why was his nickname Yummy?
Because he loved cookies.
His nickname was Yummy because he loved cookies.
Yeah.
What was his favorite cookie?
Chocolate chip. Oreo. You know them chocolate chips in the blue bag? That's what he liked.
What's your name?
My name is Gloria.
Gloria, did he have, like, when he was growing up, did he have any heroes? Did he have any sports heroes?
He liked a lot of cars. He liked to fix on cars and stuff like that.
Did he ever talk about what he wanted to be when he was growing up?
Not to my knowledge. Maybe to my mother, but not to my knowledge.
His home with his grandmother was in a working-class neighborhood, and the residents dealt with the growth of gangs in their neighborhood, one that Robert would join soon, the Black Disciples. The Black Disciples were prominent in Chicago at the time, and several thousand or so gang members in Chicago were spread out across separate fiefdoms or territories, led by men called ministers, who were usually in their 30s and 40s, who were always aiming to recruit children. Robert was known for bullying and stealing money from children and the community in the Chicago neighborhood of Roseland. He liked luxury cars and remarkably was able to drive them despite his small size. Many of his 23 felonies and 5 misdemeanors were committed in the course of running errands for street gangs. The penal system had no way to keep him out of trouble, and the courts were helpless to lock him away because he was too young for the juvenile detention system and too dangerous to be placed with children his age. Robert averaged a felony a month for the last year and a half of his life. On August 28, 1994, Robert was ordered to do a favor for his gang. He opened fire several times with a 9mm semi-automatic pistol, striking several young people. Robert quickly fled the scene. Among the victims was a 14-year-old named Siobhan Dean, who was hit by a stray bullet and later died from her gunshot wounds. The tragic shooting made national headlines. The nation was shocked by the brutality of the crime and the fact that the alleged perpetrator was an 11-year-old boy.
You knew Siobhan, yeah?
She's my niece.
She's your niece? What's your name, man?
Ida Falls.
What was she like?
What was Siobhan like? She was a very cheerful young lady, beautiful, outgoing. She was a good girl, real good girl, full of life, and she loved to come outside and play. She loved to do hair. You know, she was beginning to start doing hair, and she loved to see beauty. She liked lots of beautiful things. She wasn't a bad girl. Somebody's daughter is laying down here hurt. So, you know, I don't care who child live, I want to help. So I ran out the back door and ran right here. And I still didn't know it was my niece laying down there. And so my brother, he ran out the door, and he ran right there. And then I'm pretty sure he said he knew it was his daughter. I'm pretty sure that my brother knew what she had on, her clothing. So he ran and he looked at her and he put his hand on her and felt her pulse. So he said, she still have a pulse. So he said, call the police. The police were there so quick. I mean, they was here on arrival. And so the police, they came and put white gloves on, and they felt my niece, you know. But I knew, you know, she wasn't going to make it.
The Chicago police began a manhunt for Robert, and according to Sergeant Palmer of the Chicago Police Department at that time, Robert's actions were a gang initiation gone wrong. Robert spent the last 3 days of his life on the run. Gang members shuffled him between safe houses and abandoned buildings as the police vigorously scanned the neighborhood looking for the shooter. Robert was terrified for his life. He didn't understand why the police were after him, and his grandmother was worried about his safety and called him on the payphone to ask about his whereabouts. And he would answer crying and asking his grandmother if he could come back home. Robert managed to find his way back to his neighborhood and to his neighbor's house. Robert was visibly frightened, asked his neighbor if he could call his grandmother so he could turn himself in. He asked if they could say a prayer together. The neighbor went to go make the call, and when she came back, he was gone. The police can only guess what happened next. On August 31st, while hiding at a home of a neighbor, Robert was met by brothers Craig and Derek Hardaway, ages 16 and 14, fellow members of the Black Disciples. Robert was reportedly told that he was being taken to his safe location and ordered into a waiting car. Instead, he was brought to a railroad underpass at East 108th Street and Dauphin Avenue and was told to get on his knees. While on his knees, he was shot twice in the back of the head by the Hardaway brothers.
How long did you know him?
Since I've been staying around here,
How long was that?
about a year.
Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
What was he like?
Bad.
Bad? Like, when you say bad, what do you mean?
Fighting, stealing, breaking in people's houses.
I think you should have answered this question.
Yeah?
Shut up!
When you
Somebody
found-
open up that door.
Did you ever see, like, the police coming to his house?
Every other day.
Every other day the police were coming to his house.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? When you found out that he was killed, right? What did you think?
I mean, it shocked me. He shouldn't have got killed like that. I mean, he didn't have to die the way he was killed, but that's the life you live. That's what happened.
All of you children that are standing here, looking down, take a good look. And I want you to say within your hearts that you'll never end up like Robert. Okay? Cry if you will. Make up your mind that you will never let your life end in tragedy like this.
He was murdered by fellow gang members because they were afraid of him telling the Chicago police about the Black Gangster Disciples' operations around his neighborhood and on the Chicago North Side. Hundreds of people attended his funeral, and the story was shared by Time magazine to the rest of the nation, showing how gruesome gang activity is and how even an 11-year-old child can become a killer. Robert Lil Yummy Sandifer died August 31st, 1994. In retrospect, many of us will have different assessments and judgments about the case of Lil Yummy and the two brothers, the Hardaway brothers that killed him and that are still in prison to this day. But we must ask bigger questions. We must ask deeper questions. We must ask more poignant questions. We must analyze this in a different way. The point of me doing these true crime stories on this podcast, Changing the Narrative, is simply to be conscious about it. What can we learn socially, culturally, as a people and as a country from these tragic, horrible events? Events that oftentimes involve people who aren't deemed by society insane. Lil Yummy, the Hardaway brothers, that community in my city, my hometown, Chicago, dealt with something that we still today are dealing with. That is the deconstruction, the breakdown of morality. And that is only occurring because of the breakdown of the family. Denzel Washington was correct when prompted by the interviewer to say, it starts in the home first. They weren't coming for Lil Yummy when he was 7, 8, 9, 5, 4, 3, 2, or 1. They only came for him when he sought comfort, love, acceptance, or whatever his justification in his little 11-year-old brain was in gang life. What is it about that? Why is it so prevalent? And as it was then in the 90s, it is now, with young people still being killed, either in the crossfire of gang violence and gang wars in many cities of this country, particularly in Chicago, or being directly involved in these things. I think it's the breakdown, the outright demonization of the nuclear family. I want to look at something, an op-ed that I think explains this pretty well, written by Delano Squires. He says, Black men in my generation must lead the battle against Red Femmes, BLM, and the groups out to destroy the nuclear family. The deconstruction of the nuclear family really beginning in the 60s because of the welfare state is sadly what destroyed and led to the Lil Yummies of the world. Let's read this. America's centuries-long battle to become a more perfect union has devolved into a war on the marital union. Nowhere has the fight against marriage and the nuclear family been more intense than among Black men, women, and their children. This war is not being waged by racists in white hoods. This type of fight would spark a strong communal response. No, soldiers of dismantling the Black family wear Black Lives Matter t-shirts, call themselves radical feminists and allies, teach at prestigious universities, and often share the pigmentation of the people they want to emancipate from the patriarchy. Worse, these soldiers claim they are pro-family. He goes on to say, Brittany Cooper, the self-described Professor Crunk, is a senior strategist in this unholy war. She's a radical Black feminist and associate professor at Rutgers University, a featured contributor at MSNBC, and a favorite guest for host Joy Reid. This week, Professor Crunk has been on the front lines of the abortion debate. In an appearance on Mark Lamont Hill's show, Cooper argued that the right to abortion is essential to building strong Black families. Hear what people like Professor Crunk hear what they're saying. Killing that thing growing inside of your womb. I just want to lay out her argument. I'm not making a judgment about it. Killing that thing that is growing inside of your womb is conducive to building strong Black families. Via Twitter, I asked Professor Crunk how someone who is pro-abortion could also describe herself as pro-family. Her response captured the daddy doctrine guiding the left's attack plan for the past 60 years. Squires says, quote, "We don't need traditional nuclear families for Black thriving," she replied. Professor Cooper said out loud what the Black community has been living for the past half century, and her views are consistent with her influential Black co-conspirators in politics, media, and the entertainment industry. Turncoats are the intellectual backbone of the war on the Black family, the war to detach Black Americans from God's design for men, women, and their children. They have been incredibly effective. The number of American children born to unmarried parents has increased significantly in the past 50 years. Nowhere has this culture shift been more pronounced than within Black families. About 25% of Black children were born to unmarried parents in 1965. We're talking about how we got to the tragic crime story, the tragic saga of Lil Yummy. About 25% of black children were born to unmarried parents in 1965, the fourth of black children, which is too high already. It reached 50% by 1975 and has been over 70% since 1995. Studies show that social, emotional, and educational outcomes for children are best when they are raised by their married biological parents in low conflict relationships compared to children raised in other family arrangements. Children who are raised by their married parents achieve higher levels of education and have lower levels of teen pregnancy, criminal activity, and behavioral problems. Could it be that Lil Yummy could have been prevented from living the life he lived? And to the Hardaway brothers, had they had strong, stable families. Could that be the case? He goes on to say, Democrats and the subversive black activists and intellectuals who support them may deny this, but it doesn't change the facts. Fighting this ideology will require radical recognition of priorities and recognition of the people and strategy being used to diminish the necessity of God's marriage covenant. Step one will involve a mindset shift. We can no longer be more consumed with the history and society of our ancestors endured than with the future and society of our descendants and what they will inherit. I'm hoping children's children will read the 2019 project, a mashup of two of the most controversial documents of their times. The Moynihan Report that focused on the state of the black family in the 1960s, and the 1619 Project that situates chattel slavery as this nation's most central institution. The 2119 Project will chronicle how my generation fought to rebuild the family structure that Cooper and the other subversive activists spent generations trying to destroy. And he goes on and he goes on and he goes on. And he does something I think that is important. I want to read it to you. Speaking of how we got to Lil Yummy, quickly. He did another op-ed and he said, the Richard Snip letter proves the assault of the black mind and man has been decades in the making. He talks about he recently came across a man named Richard Snip, assuming the name was a pseudonym, although he occasionally referred to himself as Dick in other letters. Mr. Snip's letters appears to be written to political officials who wanted to know how to reach, influence, and ultimately control the minds of black voters. The letter sounds a lot like a cross between the mythical Willie Lynch letter and How to Make a Slave and the C.S. Lewis Screwtape letters, which were fictional instructions from a demon on how to lead man to damnation. He goes on, he talks about it, but he says this: the first rule you must understand, always and in everything, keep them fixated, black people, black America, on race. The second rule is equally straightforward. Teach them to make white people the center of their world. We want them to respond to our views, our opinions, values, and actions while they ignore their own. The goal of the first two rules is to use their pain against them. They know that, quote, race is a fiction. Some of their scholars even admit as much when they call it a social construct. This fiction is the central part of their identity since they were stripped of their ethnic heritage through enslavement. It continued to be the central part of their identity when they were assigned second-class citizenship during Jim Crow. Use that, he says. Use that history against them. Once you make them see themselves as Negro first, even ahead of being human, you can get down to business. He goes on to make this interesting note, and I think it's quite interesting. We're talking about how we get to a Lil Yummy, a Robert Sandifer, an 11-year-old killer. How we get to a Craig Hardaway and the Hardaway brothers. The first place to attack is the family. Start by pitting the men and women against each other. Teach them that the natural family unit should not be promoted in public and that marriage is part of, quote, white cultural norms. fill their women's heads with the same feminist propaganda ours have been indulging in for time. Tell them they are fighting oppression on two fronts, men like us in the workplace and their own husbands in the home. Teach men if they are oppressors as well. Make their views on children and families sound more like the works of Gloria Steinem than Malcolm X. If we conceive them to mimic their women who say unwanted babies are a burden, they'll come to see killing them as freedom and attempts to stop it as bondage. That's exactly what we want. Convince their women that the government is just as suitable as a father, as suitable as their men. When you do that, men will start to withdraw. They'll realize that they are no longer responsible for their children and for the children they father. That is good. That one change alone will provide a tremendous return on our investment. Convince them that, quote, conservatism is really a code word for racism, and conservatives are really closeted Klansmen. Dismiss any bootstrap talk as conservative so they can reject it. Convince them that they have no boots and that their feet don't even work. That will make them easier to carry. That is what we all want. We want them to be sustained by the strength of our hands, not their own. He goes on, he talks about many different things. Speaking about how we got to Lil Yummy. Here's his ending. Here's his final crescendo of the snip letter. In closing, remember the cardinal rule. Always and in everything. Always and in everything. Keep them fixated on race. Never let them know that these ideas started in the very institutions they clamor to send their children to. Always make them think this is propaganda from the Klan, not the Ivy League. Do this long enough, and even when we all leave for the moon, they'll claim that racism is what's holding them back. Well, at least the ones who stay will. Half will follow us because they want to be wherever we are. In control. Dick or Richard Snip. It's a bit abstract. It's a bit ambiguous, but the point, I think, is the same. I do this segment, this podcast, Changing the Narrative, to do just that, change the narrative. To look at true crime stories in a conscious way, hence being the conscious criminalist, and what we can glean from those stories and what we need to gather. I targeted this to the Black community as probably a wake-up call. No, as a wake-up call, as a rallying call to move beyond the oppression and the victimhood, to prevent future Lil Yummies and to heal past ones. That's the purpose of this sad story. You may have someone that's growing up in conditions that are horrendous, family destroyed, family all over the place, dad not here, mama doing this. You may know them, or you may be that person, just like Lil Yummy. The message to you, if you're that person, or to them, which you should preach to them day and night, is it's never too late. It's never too late. Too late for what? To be better, to do better. We cannot allow the nuclear family to be destroyed, because if we allow the nuclear family to be destroyed and we become hyper-fixated on things we can't control, we become hyper-fixated on racism and racist and white supremacy, as the academics in the Ivy League want us to. It is a mass brainwashing and psychosis that prevents us from solving real solutions within our country and in our communities. I want to see zero, if humanly possible. But I know it's not humanly possible. But I want to see as few Lil Yummies, proverbially speaking, as possible. I don't want that to be. I don't want to see or to have to say or see the signs. Don't shoot, I want to grow up. We all seen the iconic signs. This is the story of Robert Yummy Sandifer. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for tuning in.